to this week's Hearts Wide Open, where my guest has had, well, something of a varied story. Started life growing up in a cramped caravan, part of an Irish traveller family, found himself drawn into the entertainment industry, made some choices that I think would make many of us raise an eyebrow, but found that God had a plan for him, because where he was, God met with him and took him to lead a thriving church in inner city Bristol, to be part of the leadership team of the Elim movement here in the UK, and to have a voice that speaks very clearly into how the church should be reaching out to those around us. Simon Foster, welcome.
Thank you, Paul. Good to be with you.
Now, we'll talk a bit about your background in a moment, but I'm kind of wondering whether your experiences, and specifically your experience of God touching your life, has actually driven your passion that people should be loved into the kingdom rather than, as so many people seem to think, judged by the Christian community. I mean, you have a passion that the whosoever should feel loved by Christians and by Christ.
Absolutely. I think that's the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ. For the whosoevers, I live my life daily trying to reach them and connect them to the God of love that's transformed my complete life to something I never imagined it would be. So absolutely, that is my passion.
Do you think the church is sometimes too judgmental as a community? Generalisation, I know. But
it is a generalisation. I think sometimes Christians are fearful of connecting with various people groups they don't have a good understanding of, or perhaps have a bit of a kind of issue with how they live their lives. So yeah, I think there are some difficulties in how we communicate beyond some of our parameters to those who live in different environments than we do.
So what should we do with that? How should we bridge those gaps?
I think we should get out more. I think it would really help us if we, didn't have everything we do centred around a building or a particular time, and actually started to live the life that Jesus Christ died to give us, which is to be in our environments, making those environments holy by the presence of God that lives and breathes inside of us. I think we need to get out more.
So get engaged with those that we would perhaps call sinners in the same way that he did by actually walking amongst them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we'll learn a lot about God from hanging out with people who don't know God.
You, of course, your lifestyle, your experiences, your history has given you a particular perspective on the fact that God is interested in meeting people where they are. You grew up, as I say, as part of an Irish traveller family. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, we weren't travellers in the sense of my big fat gypsy wedding travellers. We were travellers in the sense that we were show business people, probably a little like circus people.
Yeah.
We'd move from town to town and set up a booth, which is a tent with kind of wooden sides on it, and we would do shows there for as long as anyone turned up to kind of pay their fee to get in and do it, and then we'd move on to the next place. So
what was that like for you as a child? I mean, a very pretty picture of you there, but how old were you there?
I was about 6 there.
Right, OK. Yeah. So what was that like for you? Because schooling and that sort of thing would have been
I think
haphazard, maybe?
It was a bit haphazard. Thankfully, my family are very curious people, so they had a lot of insights and understandings of life that perhaps I wouldn't have learnt at school. I'm not so sure all of that was beneficial. But yeah, we kind of helped ourselves along the way, and then we settled down into a residential caravan site when I was about 7.
Right.
And from there on in, I kind of steadily went to school.
So your family treaded the boards, as you say, put on shows, and presumably it was all hands to the pump. You would all get involved in that.
My mother had a little saying, actually, it's become one of mine. There's no passengers in this house, she'd say. And so everybody had to do something, and whether you sang or you put the stage up, you took it down, you put the gear up or took it down, everybody did something, even if it was making the tea. And
I mean, was there a sense in which growing up then you felt a part of society, or slightly apart from society?
I think slightly apart from society. When we kind of pulled in and we settled down as a community, there were 3 families of us that lived on this caravan site in South Wales, hence the little confusion about the accents, I suppose. But actually, we would go into school on a bus, and every time we picked up that bus in the morning, there would be fights and scraps and a variety of other chantings that took place, because we were seen as different. And you throw enough mud at a wall, it tends to stick. you know, nobody knows that they're different until you meet other people who live differently.
Yes.
And so that was our kind of education process that we were slightly different.
Did you kind of feel a bit of rejection by those around you? Did that make you want to go, well, OK, you see me as different, I'll be different? Or did it make you go, I'm desperate to fit in?
No, I wasn't desperate to fit in. I saw their lives. You know, every weekend in our family, we were out singing and, you know, learning all kinds of musical instruments and having just the most exceptional life. And Monday through to Friday, we were in school. And when they compared stories of their weekends and ours, I thought ours topped it.
And come the 80s, you were actually starting to build quite a career for yourself, weren't you? Because you were performing in, well, interesting venues with interesting hairstyles.
Yes, very interesting hairstyles. Not so interesting venues, but yeah. Well, I come from a family of singers, and so the whole of our life, as kids, we grew up singing.
That is a very impressive mullet.
I have brought it with me. Sadly, no longer does it exist.
I don't know. It was very stylish at the time.
At the time, great terminology.
Yeah, at the time. And you were, I mean, singer. That was your approach.
My whole life, yeah. I was a singer, dancer, worked in a variety of different shows. Some in the West End, cruise ships, anywhere where anybody pay me some money to do it. Really.
So a fair bit of travel involved as well.
Loads of travelling. Travelled all over the world.
So, am I right in suspecting that the peak of your performance would have been this? That's very impressive footwork you've got there.
I still have the moves. What can I say?
Do you say? So every Sunday in Bristol, in the church, that's you?
Maybe not. Maybe not. I would like to think that things have changed slightly since then.
Indeed. So how does a guy with a Welsh accent end up representing Ireland in Eurovision? I mean, that's what that was. That time you were performing in Eurovision with the Duskies.
The Duskies. Well, let me explain how that happened. I'm actually Irish. I was born in Southern Ireland, and we moved to Wales, as I said earlier, when I was about 7. And so I have a Welsh accent because that was the formative years of my education, really. But yeah, I went back to Ireland at the age of 19, 20, and my cousins, those 3 girls are 2 of them sisters, 1 of them is another cousin, and myself were asked if we would demo a song, and that song got through to Eurovision and represented Ireland.
And I know I should know this, but in 1982, when you were singing at Eurovision, I was busy planning a wedding.
All right.
Or being included in the planning of a wedding. How did you do?
We came 10th, I think, or somewhere
That's not
around.
bad.
It's not good for Ireland.
Yeah, fair enough, because Ireland's got a good reputation in Eurovision, but it's still not bad. It's better than an awful lot of British acts have done since.
Better than the recent results.
Did that open the door for you then?
No, it actually closed some doors.
Did it?
Yeah, I think Eurovision obviously is not, you know, it's not hip-hop, is it, or R&B and so on. So some of the areas of music I was attracted to, actually Eurovision didn't really help my career a lot with that. But beyond Eurovision, I had lots of experiences recording with MCA and EMI in London and various other things that actually I got to sing the songs I enjoyed singing.
Yeah, and found yourself in what was, well, I described it at the beginning as quite a heady and even hedonistic lifestyle, was it? I mean, you did get caught up in some pretty, well, would you look back and say unsavoury things?
Oh, they didn't seem unsavoury at the time.
Yeah.
I think looking back, I think you do what you think you need to do to get where you need to go. And so I was involved in a world where the kind of boundaries were far-reaching and wide. They weren't narrow, you know. So it wasn't an environment where anyone thought I was doing anything particularly unusual. Yeah. But you know, obviously looking back, there were some decisions I made. I think I could have made better ones.
But it was very much the sex, drugs, rock and roll sort of lifestyle, wasn't it? Yeah. And I wonder if that gives you a particular perspective, because people are very quick to identify people who are celebrities living that lifestyle and find reasons to criticise them. But I wonder if, well, like with Miley Cyrus, for example, people are giving her such a hard time at the moment and criticising her so much. Do you have a different perspective about what's going on in somebody like that's life?
I think it's very difficult to grow up in the public eye, and it's very difficult to become an adult whenever the whole image-making industry around you has celebrated your childhood. Yeah. I think those transitions are horrific for people who have, you know, very public personas. And if we've learned anything about that, we should look back to the transition Michael Jackson took from that
Yes.
season to the one he went into as an adult. It was a very difficult time. Yeah, I have nothing but sympathy for Miley Cyrus. Of course, some of her actions are very public and
Yes.
and
And she has responsibility for her
yes, she
actions.
does. She does for that. But she's trying to find her adult self when everyone's trying to tie her to her child self. It's a bit difficult.
Now, for you, part of that lifestyle at the time meant that you ended up involved in gay relationships, same-sex relationships. You ended up going to nightclubs and gay bars and that sort of thing. Can you identify, because now you're married, you have a family, can you identify where that impetus, that orientation came from for you at that time?
I can. I don't think it was, you know, primarily at that stage of my life that I discovered that I had those tendencies or desires. As far back as the age of the photograph you showed earlier, I felt I was different sexually to other people. Wouldn't have identified that as homosexuality, just knew that I didn't relate particularly well with my brothers and cousins who were male, and related very well with my cousins who were female.
Right.
And so that kind of gender confusion started quite early on in my life. Of course, as you go through puberty, you seek to explore all manner of expressions of sexuality, and I think that I ended up involved in relationships with people. It seemed like the right choice to me. In fact, it seemed like the only choice. It's interesting how people say, you know, you choose to be gay, particularly sometimes around Christian circles, like you wake up on a Tuesday and suddenly decide, hey ho, from tomorrow onwards. It doesn't work like that. People don't make decisions in a vacuum. They make decisions in a circumstance. And so the first time I had a sexual relationship with someone, I crossed into a lifestyle that in many ways consolidated a lot of the internal world that I was living out.
And yet you found yourself eventually turning your back on that lifestyle because of a very specific experience of God. I mean, tell us first of all about Kevin and Paul and that sort of initial opening of the door to how God felt about you.
Well, Kevin and Paul were in my life. In fact, Paul was the first person as a young man of 16, 17 that I had a sexual relationship with. And he and Kevin were a long-term relationship. So they were friends of mine for many, many years. Their relationship ended. One was living in America, the other in Great Britain. And I kept in touch with them. They were friends. And met with them. A number of years later, I'd been travelling around singing, came back to Great Britain and met with them, and noticed that they had both changed and started asking a whole host of questions, you know. And consequently, they began to talk to me a little bit about their discovery of this man they called Jesus.
What was it about them that had changed? What was the identifier for you?
I think more for Kevin than Paul. Kevin was quite, you know, a militant individual, very strong, very charismatic, and wanted to put the world to rights. And I was very impressed by him. He was highly creative in the fashion industry, and very, very much the kind of person I admired and wanted to be, perhaps. When I met him after he'd become a Christian, some of that angst and some of that, you know, militantness had faded, and there was a wonderful sense of having found something in his life that really was far better than the way he had been living.
And that night that you sat down and talked with them and they unpacked for you Jesus' love for you, how did that impact you?
Well, that came after a series of conversations. We'd been out to a disco somewhere and came back in. It was early hours of the morning. And I brought the subject up, actually, because I'm curious about that kind of stuff. It was back then. And I said, what is this Christianity? What is Christianity? I was raised a Catholic, so I thought I understood what that meant. But seemingly the way they lived was very different than my experiences in church. They were excited about going to church and excited about worshipping God and so on. So I started the conversation up, and we arrived at a place in that conversation where they said this statement to me. I realize now, many years later, it's kind of, you know, it's a soundbite from the Christian world, but they said these words to me. They said, if you were the only person on this earth, Jesus so loved you, he gave his life for you. And I had a real difficulty with that, because in my culture, what happens in my culture is that when you have a debt to someone, you have to, you know, you have to honor that debt. And so I'm puzzled by the fact that Jesus had died for me.
By your culture, you mean
my travelling culture,
traveling,
yeah. And so consequently, I owed God something, and I didn't know what to give him. And as we talked until the early hours of the morning, I realised the only decent conclusion would be a life for a life. So I gave Jesus my life because he had given his life for me.
And you were transformed, and your life was miraculously resolved, and things were never had a problem again.
Absolutely no. I hovered off the ground. No, I didn't. No, that's where things really got interesting, because that particular night, as I left the flat and drove back to Birmingham, a journey that would take probably about 40 minutes, it took me 5 hours to get home. And I kept pulling into the side of the road all the time because I was so overwhelmed by the love of God. And after many tissues and many stops, I arrive home, and it's now probably about 9 in the morning, or a little bit later than that. And I had to tell someone what had happened to me. And to be honest, I didn't equate it with a prayer. I equated it with an experience that had taken a number of hours of my life. And I waited for my mum to get up at the crack of noon. And she got up with a fag on and came downstairs. And I said, "Mum, I've become a born-again Christian." And she began sprinkling me with holy water out of a little fountain she had near the door. If you've ever heard of Mrs. Brown, my mother's not too far away from that as a caricature. So I realised that perhaps what had happened to me wasn't really something that instantly my family would understand.
Yes,
but
yeah.
I was utterly changed. Not my lifestyle, but my desire for God and my love for God immediately started to appear in my life.
At what point then did your lifestyle start to change? Because that was something you started to tussle with, wasn't it?
It was. Actually, prior to becoming a Christian, having been on the gay scene for many, many years and tried a number of times to engage in relationships that I thought would fulfill me, I had decided about 18 months prior to this I didn't want to have sexual relationships with men. It wasn't a spiritual reason. I just realised that perhaps it was a bit empty. I'd seen other people engage with those things, and they seemed very short-lived for them. And I suppose I was looking for Mr. Right, not Mr. Right Now. Yeah. And so consequently, I would go to the gay clubs, I'd hang out with my friends, I'd enjoy the dancing and the whole kind of atmosphere, but I wasn't engaging in sexual relations. And so when I became a Christian, the two guys who led me to Jesus didn't tell me anything about that. We didn't talk about homosexuality, we didn't talk about what the Bible had to say about it. They just said to me, take this Bible, take it home with you, and God will answer every question about you, your life, and your future out of this Bible.
That was an approach that was quite ahead of its time, wasn't it?
Yes, I suppose it was.
Yeah.
I mean, there was no course. I didn't fill out a form. I didn't put my hand up, and I didn't have to recite a prayer after them. But I truly, truly experienced God. And so for the first 3 weeks of those, crazy early days of my Christian walk with Jesus, I kept feeling this love. It got stronger, more intense. I began to know things about people, and ended up having conversations about Jesus in the most unlikeliest of places. I was working in a nightclub called Heaven, which is a gay nightclub in London, with what was known then as the Dream Boys, which is obviously a group of guys that take their clothes off for a living. And I'm leading one of them to Jesus in the back room in between sets. Nobody taught me to do any of that. I didn't even know you were supposed to. I just couldn't keep it in. But I had this question one day, because I talked to God all the time from that moment. And the question was, God, what do you feel about me being gay? Because I'd never had the conversation with Kevin and Paul, and I knew that if I went to a church and asked, I'd seen enough around to know that they'd have some very strong opinions about that. And I thought, if I'm going to walk this walk, I want to know what God feels about that. So I'd never read the Bible in my life. I wasn't a great reader anyway. And I picked up the Bible and I said, Jesus, tell me what you think about me being a homosexual. And I opened the Bible. And the first words that my eyes fell upon were halfway down a page. They come out of 1 Corinthians chapter 6. And they read something like this: "Do you not know that no homosexual, adulterer, murderer, fornicator shall enter the kingdom of heaven?" And I'd love to tell you that I rejoiced and celebrated and danced and sang praises to Jesus, but actually was so angry. Because 3 weeks prior to this, the message of if I was the only person in this whole world, God loved me so much he'd send Jesus for me, didn't make sense now. Because it looked like God was saying, but you're never going to get the full thing because you have orientations or desires that are outside of my parameters. So I threw the Bible at the wall, and I went out that night to a gay club, absolutely intent on having a relationship with somebody, was dancing with this guy, and it looked like it was going in the direction I wanted it to, and suddenly I saw his eyes in the lights. And it was almost like a moment where, you know, everything stood still for me, and I realized that he was showing me, without intending to, the brokenness of his soul, the desperation of his loneliness, all of those things. And I found myself telling him, if you were the only person on the planet, Jesus Christ, as you can imagine, it didn't end up as I expected it, perhaps, at the beginning of the evening. But I remember coming home that night, and at those days I thought I was a bit good looking and everything. I checked myself out in the mirror, and I looked in the mirror and I said, what's happened to you? You're a freak. You are a freak. And I prayed. I said, God, tell me what's happened to me. Show me what's taken place in my life, because I don't get it. And I opened the Bible again randomly, and I read, you are a new creature in Christ. Behold, the old has gone, and I've made all things new. And that started this conversation that hasn't ended for 29 years with God, as he seeks to show me and reveal to me who I really am and what he desires for my life and how I am called to live a particular way as a result.
And that's an interesting way that you put that there, because many people, well, I think many people would have been surprised at the fact that God showed up in a gay club to start with, but that he did. Many people would have gone, well, that was the transformation. You were, in inverted commas, healed. But you put it very clearly, actually, no, it's an ongoing work, maybe not so much around homosexuality now, but around other areas of our lives that's ongoing until, well, for as long as we live.
I think, to be honest with you, and I think it's always a good place to do that when people ask a question, I don't think the issue was that I was homosexual. I think the issue was that I didn't know who I was. And I think as God began to show me my truest identity as a son, as someone in relationship with him who was fathered by the most exceptional father, some of those broken areas of my life as I grew up that I didn't experience in practical ways actually began to be restored.
That's
and
interesting.
it's very easy to put labels on people and to, you know, try and alter people's behavior.
Cy Rogers said something about his experience, that areas of lack in his life turned him in a direction, and then in meeting Jesus, that lack was healed. It wasn't about healing from homosexuality, it was about healing the areas of lack that enabled him to be the person God wanted him to be. Is that how you feel about it?
Yeah, and having worked with a number of people who are seeking to have that type of transformation, or understanding at least of who they are and what that looks like for them to walk with Jesus in that, I realized that for me, one of the major issues was that I didn't have a strong bond or relationship with my father. I always felt I was a disappointment to him. I always felt that I didn't measure up. He was like a big, strong Irish guy who'd been a farmer, you know, and so you've got this like very effeminate little boy painting pictures and singing and dancing and prancing around. I think it must have been quite difficult for him looking back. All I felt was just rejection, and at times even to the point of being crushed by just a look. It's difficult, therefore, to understand your masculinity when those around you actually clearly demonstrate that you don't carry what they think you should carry. You go to school, that's reinforced by people in school. You get through puberty, and that's reinforced by your orientations towards people of the same sex. And you know, more and more agreements that you make with that create this, you know, parameter by which you decide to live your life. This is who I am, and this is who I'll be. And then God turns up, and he turns the whole thing upside down, inside out, and starts to ask those really difficult questions. Well, who are you, Simon? And what does that look like? And why do you do that? And why do you feel that? And, you know, I went through this whole season very early on in my Christianity where I asked questions about absolutely everything.
Yeah.
Why do I think that's attractive and that's not attractive? And as I started to hear some responses from the Bible and in my own intimate times with God, I began to realize that this wasn't something I was born with. This was something that, in fact, my environment had encouraged, or at least the voids that existed there had produced a vacuum that I stepped into and allowed those things to take place.
As you move forward, you discovered God was calling you into what we would have called back then the ministry, to become a church leader. You got married, you have a family, you lead a church, you're part of the Elim National Leadership Team. In fact, there you are on your wedding day.
Yes.
Looking very sophisticated.
That's the first time and the
Very
last.
dapper. But I wonder, as you started to take up a role in leadership, whether people in the church saw the grace of God in you as the story, or saw the fact that you had been in a gay club as the story.
Yeah, I think the early days, trying to find my way into a Christian community were very interesting. I had the mullet and a 24-inch waist and spray-on leather clothes, and was pretty much a new romantic, you know, around that time.
Oh, yes.
And the church I started attending, I didn't attend initially. It took about 4 months for me to think maybe going to church would be a good idea. Actually, they were quite a traditional Pentecostal environment, and you can imagine how difficult it was for them, and indeed how difficult it became for me. Some of the experiences weren't helpful. I mean, people moved away from me. It was the 80s, and the whole, you know, conversation on the media was about AIDS and HIV, and so people had a lot of suspicions and fear about engaging with somebody who openly declared that he had lived this kind of lifestyle. Those memories, I think, will last forever. Had it not been for the relationship I have with Jesus, I don't think I'd be sitting here today talking to you, because it was that kept me. It is that keeps me. And so, you know, the peripherals of the church, at times there's been some great people who have seen something in me that have, you know, teased it out and encouraged it and so on. And I've had a few of those along the way, but I think the only reason I'm here is because of God.
You see, I said at the beginning that Kevin and Paul, in giving you the Bible and basically sending you away, they were kind of ahead of their time, because a lot of Christians at that time would have tried to tell you, you need to do A, B, C, D and E. Yeah. But actually, did they understand, do you think, that experience of God's love would be the thing that would carry you forward?
Perhaps they did. I can't answer that. I don't see them anymore. Our lives have gone in very different directions. But I think they were perhaps cautious not to bring up the one thing that would have blown everything. And that was the issue of what I did with my life sexually. I think there was a wisdom in that. And even if it was something that they were misguided in doing, or perhaps something they overlooked in the conversation, I thank God for it. Because the reality was, had that been presented to me at the beginning, I'm not sure I would have agreed to give my life to Jesus at that point. There's this time, isn't there, for everything. Yes. You have to be ready for some of those things. And I think I wasn't ready back then.
How has it influenced where you are now as a church leader and as a leader in a movement, a denomination that impacts right across the nation?
That's crazy, isn't it? That I often say to people who talk to me about, you know, the calling on my life, I say I only went out for a loaf of bread. I actually don't quite know how I ended up here. The reality is that I didn't seek leadership, and nor do I seek leadership. I think I just tried to follow as best I could the leading of God in my life, and taking a step out of the world of show business and singing and music and art and heading off to Bible college was a crazy day for me, because that's going back into an institution that, for me, you know, school wasn't the best experience in the world. So, you know, I wasn't going in, you know, with a great deal of positive expectations, but I quickly realized in the learning process that I wasn't maybe as thick as I thought I was, and I felt that I should maybe just explore the possibility of whether or not I could go and be part of a church somewhere and help out in some way. To my surprise, there were about 4 or 5 offers that came around that time, and it was difficult to choose which was the right one. I ended up in a church in Birkenhead with a great man called Paul Epton, an Elim church, and he was an out-and-out evangelist. And of course, because of the way I'd been living, I fitted in a little bit with that, and perhaps our perspectives would have been slightly different, but our goal was the same.
And yet it has created a position where this passion that you have, and I can see why you have it, because of your experience, that actually if we focus more on showing people Jesus' love and letting them experience that for themselves, we don't need to dot every I and cross every T, because that experience will lead them to that place anyway. I mean, that is still, even now, that's still quite a radical message in a lot of sections of the church, isn't it?
Is it? It's my life, so if that's radical, then I have to, you know, kind of tip my cap to those who think it may be. But for me, this is just my life. I can't stress enough to people that Jesus comes through at every level, in every which way possible, for people who are looking for love. for me, the other stuff that comes around that, it's like you know, you marry the wife, you end up with a house, and you have kids, and you have responsibilities, and all of those things are part of the outworking of that love relationship. But if you ever lose sight of the fact that you married somebody you wanted to spend the rest of your life with, and it becomes about those other things, then, you know, thank God for the wife I have. She gladly reminds me of that. So for me, Jesus is the main event. All day, every day, we want to connect people to the face of God and the heart of God and see their lives transformed, because I do believe that that beholding thing changes everything.
It's interesting, isn't it? Maybe it is the case that if we trusted the love of Jesus to impact people's lives more, we would be more effective in sharing that love, because it's not down to us to transform people's lives. It is, as Simon's experienced, down to Jesus. And maybe then, more of the world around us would feel that we are loving them into the kingdom than judging them into the kingdom. Simon, good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Good to see you, Paul. Thank you for having me.